Pottery is the catch-all term to describe decorative or functional objects formed from clay, then fired in a large oven called a kiln. The pottery is then usually painted. There are several different types of pottery, such as porcelain, stoneware, and earthenware. Earthenware produced on a larger scale is typically cast in moulds. This long-time British manufacturer is famous for its bold floral and fruit designs, which feature raised lines. At the factory, the mould maker creates a plaster of Paris model of the piece on a lathe, verifying the shape and dimensions with a profile. He uses the model to cast a two-part production mould, also out of plaster. A caster takes that mould and fills it with liquefied clay, called slip. Once a layer hardens along the cavity wall, he tips the mould and pours out the excess. It takes skill to know how long to let the clay set before tipping. In about 2 hours, the clay inside the mould hardens sufficiently to be safely extracted. The caster now puts the piece into what they call the damp room. There overnight, in 100% humidity, the clay fully hardens. It can now be safely worked on a lathe. Using specialized turning tools, a highly skilled craftsman applies just the right amount of pressure to form the piece to the final shape. In this case, a jar. After applying the manufacturer's stamp, he mounts the jar on a potter's wheel and, pressing with a wet sponge, smooths the surface. A designer creates the decoration on paper, then sketches it onto a sample jar. Then she traces her design onto clear cellophane and indicates with red marker lines where that cellophane bends around the jar. An artisan now takes the cellophane and traces the design with a specially designed ink. Using the red contour marks as a guide, another artisan positions and presses the cellophane against the jar to be painted. This transfers the design onto the surface in ink. The ink will disappear once the piece is fired. Next, she creates the design's signature raised lines. This technique is called tube lining. She traces the ink lines while squeezing slip through a tiny nozzle. Not only does this work require a steady hand, she must also squeeze with even pressure to keep the line thickness consistent. The jar goes into a controlled drying room overnight, and from there into the skilled hands of a painter. They apply just a tiny drop of watery paint. Then, with another touch of the brush, they soak up the excess paint. She uses her finger to gently blend colour transitions. The jar is now ready to be fired in the kiln. The heating phase lasts 8 hours, during which the temperature peaks at 1100 degrees Celsius. This cures the clay and triggers a chemical reaction in the paint, which produces rich, vibrant colours. After a 16-hour cool-down, they take the jar out of the kiln and submerge it in a glaze, which contains powdered glass. They coat the painted clay surface thoroughly inside and out. Once the glaze dries, it's back into the kiln for a second firing. This one overnight at just above 1100 degrees Celsius. The powdered glass in the glaze melts, forming a solid glass layer over the painted clay surface. This seals the earthenware so that it's no longer absorbent and therefore capable of containing liquids. This, of course, is essential for a vase or dinnerware. Glaze also makes the surface shinier, highlighting the beauty of the artwork. Smash it. Or not, hopefully.